Welcome to Keeping the Hunger, Building the Next Big Thing. This is brought to you by Worklife. I'm your host, Adrienne Lawrence, and for the next 45 minutes, you will relish this fireside chat moderated by Iggy CEO Lindsay Pettingill as she chronicles the lessons, the victories, the trials in building the next big thing. Lindsay's going to be chatting with three founders: Phil Libin, co-founder and CEO of All Turtles and Mmhmm; Ben Rubin, co-founder and CEO of Slash Talk; and Avni Patel Thompson, founder and CEO of Modern Village. Take it away, Lindsay.
Hi, thanks so much for that introduction. Really happy to be here and happy to facilitate and moderate a conversation with our panelists here. So, just to hit the ground running, I mean, you all have super impressive track records, careers, etc. I'm excited to take some time to have you share some wisdom about what you've built, how you've built, etc. And I just want to start off at a really high level, as you all have built multiple startups and products and things. There is this transition time when you move from one to the other, right? There's often sometimes that's exciting, sometimes it's can be mourning can be really required. And so I know we have a host of experiences here, and I'd just like to hear a little bit about those transitions. When you leave one startup to start another, you're leaving things behind and stepping into new things. So who can, I'd like for y'all to tell us a little bit about that. What is that journey like, and what are the things you take with you? What are the things that you leave behind? Very broad. We can go in so many different directions. Who wants to start?
Happy to go.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Sure. So I guess first I can just quickly introduce myself. So my name is Avni Patel Thompson. I am, as was mentioned, the founder and CEO of Modern Village. Our mission is to build technology that lightens the load of everyday parenting. It's a journey that I've been on from a startup standpoint, probably for close to 5 years. My husband and I, we live in Vancouver, Canada now, and we've got 2 school-aged kids. So this is a lot of fun with a 6 and an 8-year-old. But my background is from consumer. I started my career at Procter & Gamble and went on to do a whole lot of things, living in lots of different countries and managing a lot of different businesses and brands. And I've always loved this idea of solving everyday problems in the lives of people. But it wasn't until I became a parent that I really became passionate about what those solutions look like and how to use technology to do it. And so about 5 or 6 years ago, I started my previous company, Poppy, mostly just to serve myself. It was super self-serving, which is my husband and I both work. We were living in Seattle at the time. I was at Starbucks, he was at Amazon. So crazy careers, 2 really young kids. And I just experienced, it's literally untenable right now for, 2 working parents to make all of this stuff work. If you don't have parents in town, you don't have the communities that you grew up in. And I think for me, the big question is why is that? And what would it take to change that? And so what Poppy was an exploration, what it turned out to be in words that I now know is a 2-sided service marketplace that found and vet childcare providers that lived in our communities on one side, and we matched them up with families on the other side when they had gaps in care. But for me, at the very, very beginning, it was just literally, what is it that makes this experience feel a lot more tenable? Happy to go into a lot more of the details, but over that 3 or 4 year journey, did lots of really incredible things. We did Y Combinator, we raised a seed fund, built an incredible team solving an incredibly hard problem. If you think about on-demand marketplace, but in services and childcare. So if you think about trust and safety, all of the different things and all of the operations side. We built an incredible kind of service that was very much needed. The challenge is, though, of course, as we talk about venture-backed companies, the path to scale and the path to the economics to make that work. And that certainly wasn't there in a way that we needed it to be. And so after about 3 and a bit years, made the hard decision to shut it down. And so I can speak to that. And so that was my experience with transition, which is at the end of 2018, making the call to call it and shut it down. All the things that were related to communicating that and dealing with that. And then over the course of 2019, the journey to do it again. And for me, I guess I'm fortunate to say Modern Village is a continuation of that original kind of vision. But for me, this time, it's how do you do it with software first? And so we're taking a look at what is the role of software, sort of this idea of a family OS that I think is necessary. If we think about, we've got incredible collaboration tools for all of our teams in our lives, except our most important ones, like our families. And so what does that look like? And that's what we're on a mission to build.
That's awesome. Super helpful. You shared a lot there that I was taking note of. I mean, one was definitely, you mentioned the path to scale and how that was ultimately quite difficult for Poppy. Seems like that influenced the path that you're taking in your next endeavor. So I'm wondering if folks can talk about that path to scale. Experiences, doing it for the second time. How did you approach the path to scaling differently? What were like maybe lessons that in retrospect seem very clear, but at the time when you're going through them, maybe aren't? Any thoughts there?
You got to randomly pick a person to ask. We're all shy. This is a
Phil.
Common trait of startup founders.
Yeah, whole panel of introverts here.
Exactly.
But you just took a risk. Thank you for doing that. I'm gonna hand the baton to you. Can you weigh in on this?
Yeah, and thanks for the question. I mean, I think my career and track record are, moderately impressive at best. But I'm on my 5th startup, so I guess whatever lessons there are to be learned, I'm maybe not learning them, fast enough.
That's a lesson in itself, though, right?
Yeah.
Like just keep going.
I can remember what it was like the second time around. I probably felt like I knew all sorts of things from my first startup that I learned that I applied to my second one. But by the time you're on number 5, it all kind of runs together. If you're like, let's say you're a skier, right? Which I'm definitely not. I'm like a dedicated indoorsman. Don't pursue any athletic activities. But let's say you're like a dedicated, like a really hardcore skier, and you're like in your 20s and you're skiing. I don't know. I'm going to get in trouble with this analogy because I don't know anything about skiing. I don't know. What do you ski? Moguls? Bumps? Is that a thing?
Hills?
Whatever, right? Hills, yeah. So you're skiing and you're like, Olympic level in your 20s and you're great. And, everyone kind of knows that like, yeah, you're kind of damaging your knees, right? But like, it's okay. It's a risk. It's, something worth taking. But like, no one expects for you to be skiing as hard when you're 50, right? Like by the time you're 50, no one is like, well, now you've been skiing for 30 years. You've got 30 years of experience. People understand that like your knees are hardware and like, yeah, you've got a lot more experience skiing in the 30 years, but no one's going to expect you to be able to do the same things as you did in your 20s. And I think it's because people think that like knees are hardware, but somehow like your brain is software. Mm. And I think a lot of people think that like, yeah, you were like starting companies and doing stuff in your 20s, and I'm 48, I'm not 50 yet, but I will be soon. And it's like, oh, you must be so much more experienced. It must be so much easier. But like, no, it's not. It's harder, just like it would be if you were skiing, because like all of the accumulated, damage that you do to yourself by doing this extremely intense activity, like that, all that stuff adds up. And your brain is no more, software than your knees. Like they're both just as prone to damage and to taking care of yourself. And I think all of us, or many of us entrepreneurs, like we learn a bunch of really bad lessons in our 20s. And we just we don't think of this as a physical activity. So, I think the one thing that I wish I had figured out earlier is that, yeah, like it takes a toll, and you gotta think about how you're going to take care of yourself, and you got to think about how you're going to be able to do this for decades, just like you would if you were, pursuing a physical activity as your main identifier. And I don't think I started thinking about that until I was into my 40s, which I guess is, better late than never, but it should have occurred to me in my first startup, not my 5th.
I definitely resonate with that. Just maybe to bring in another bad sporting analogy, but like the marathon sprint analogy. I think like with the first, I think I was just so like frankly shocked that we got to some semblance of like product market fit, and you're just trying to hang on and you're trying to just do the things, and you're like, you feel like this is what like starting a startup is supposed to feel like. And it took me a while to realize I was doing like very unhealthy things for myself, for my relationship, for my kids, like all that kind of stuff. This time around, a lot more intentional about like, this is going to be a marathon, and let's just figure out how to like minimize. It's still very hard years you're putting on. But, you know, can we not make some of those mistakes, and just understanding that, how are we going to pace ourselves?
I remember the first time like a board member used that analogy with me. They're like, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. I was like, I don't know what either of those
No, you're sprinting the marathon.
Yeah, I don't understand.
So this is fascinating. You know, as we're talking about this, I'm thinking, I actually just learned to ski a couple years ago. I didn't learn as a kid. And the thing they say about skiing is, like, it's quite easy to learn how to ski, but to master it, it takes a lifetime, right? And you know, I'm already outing myself as someone who's quite corny with this, but I think that's part of what we're talking about, right? Like, you can't learn it, but to do it. I talk to a lot of aspiring founders, and you know, focus on the aspiring. And there's a lot of like, oh, I'm not ready. I'm not. And you ask them, well, what would it take for you to be ready? And most of them don't know. And I think they're touching on something, you know, that this thing that we're talking about here, it's like no one really knows how to do this, right? And doing it in a healthy way is even harder. And so I'm curious, like, to get into the grit of that a little bit, right? We're sort of talking around, you know, there's the sprinting a marathon, which we get that. What are, can folks like share some of these like specific things that you wouldn't do again? I'm guessing this, given my own founder journey, I'm guessing this has to do with work-life balance maybe, but there's probably lots of other things there. Ben, do you have any thoughts there?
Yeah, I'm happy to chime in and pick the baton up. I think to the point of transition and the point of the analogy of the body, I think that's, this journey is a relationship with oneself. And as you're coming into this, at least for me, the experience was also not growing up in America and coming from Israel, it was damped with a lot of insecurity. And is this relationship with yourself, when you first get something that is kind of working, you find that because of your lack of experience, or the hardware that Phil is talking about, you become more reactive and you become much more short-term, and you lack the confidence in yourself to be able to believe in yourself first, and actually not believe in yourself because you're stating it or you're repeating a mantra, because you actually have seen yourself doing this thing. And that's something that you cannot really teach unless you go for it, unless you actually have done it multiple times and, you know, messed up a couple of times. And I think the accumulation of that is make us, to use the analogy, smarter skiers. But and it means that we may be able to do actually more complicated things faster with less energy. And I think Olympian swimmers actually do it the best, where it looks like there's minimum effort and they just keep with the flow, and they know how to put a lot of emphasis on the intention. And when you talked about transition, for me, transition between companies, it's a wonderful moment to try not to rush to the next thing, and try to really sit and do some sort of indexing and inventory of your learning, and sit with it, and sit with if you're a very passionate entrepreneur, probably a lot of your self-worth is built into your image as an entrepreneur. So being in between, for me at least, was really uncomfortable position. And in this uncomfortable position, you might find yourself jumping into something that maybe is not as thoughtful or not the best, you know, the intention is not there yet. So what I've done to the specifics that you're asking, For 6 to 9 months, I've sat in the office of a VC firm and kind of thought about ideas and tried not to rush into them, even if the opportunity was there, and then do actually the work of understanding what it is that didn't work, what it is that worked in the past venture, what are the things that I'm learning about myself, not actually concluding anything, and just be okay with not knowing. And I felt for me, it was a really inflection point in being confident in myself and myself not knowing. And I think you bring that actually with you when you can create an environment at a team where, especially in the 0 to 1 stage, where it's okay not to know. And there's a framework of how to ask questions versus rushing to answers.
That was awesome. Thanks so much, Ben. There's so much there.
Can I add just a couple reactions, because I resonated a lot with what you mentioned. One thing I just wanted to say is that my experience was that out of like my first startup, I sort of learned how to do a startup. And maybe that's just because for me, I spent over a decade at large companies, and there's a certain way you do things when you've already got like products and you've got like distribution and consumers and things like that, that I had to almost unlearn. And there's a lot of things. There's like how to hire, how to be a good partner, how to like all of these different fundraising, lots of different things that the second time around feels like so much easier just because like you've understood some of those mechanics. So I just wanted to kind of get that point out. That might be fairly obvious, but for me in particular, like the first time you had to almost unlearn some things or learn how to do a startup. The second thing that really this concept of identity, I think, especially as founders, and again, maybe this just me, but because the types of products that I'm building are so deeply rooted in mission and like a problem that is deeply important to me, there's such an aspect of identity from a founder standpoint. And for Poppy, I think that was one of the hardest things I had to, for 4 or 5 years, I was the founder of Poppy. Like it was like Avni, founder of Poppy. And some people would even call me Poppy. Like it was this kind of like melding into one. And I guess to be sort of a little bit vulnerable about this, that I found after I shut it down, it's almost like the death of something, like a person, which is that it almost remains very alive in your heart, in your mind. But it's one of the hardest things is that it feels like all of the potential of what it could have been also gets erased. And it was sort of an experience to try to go to places and try to introduce yourself as like, who are you? And I can only speak from my experience of like having to shut down a company, but I think it speaks to just identity. And it was like terribly like I guess I was shocked at how I've never tried to tie my identity to any one thing, but for me, this one experience was quite tied to identity, and having to extract that and then choose to kind of go back into another thing was certainly an experience. And the last thing I'll just really quickly say is that for me, I knew I wasn't ready until I got obsessed with a problem again. And I found myself similarly almost like jumping into like 2 or 3 different things that felt like, you know, could be right, should be right. But I held myself back, and there's a number of people like super close that helped give me space or like protect that space by like supporting me to make sure that I took that time. But I think that's just such an important point, especially if anyone else is in that kind of same place, is that make sure that you're really ready. And for me, the really ready was like, again, obsessed with an idea that I couldn't get out of my head, and I had to go solve it.
That's awesome. Thanks for that vulnerability and just for sharing that. There's so much to sort of gnaw on here. I'm curious about, so you brought up identity, and obviously our startups are critical to our identities, as you mentioned, for better or worse, right? I think it's related to the obsessiveness with which we pursue these problems. We're just so enamored with them that they stick. Again, not just the problems with but the startups that we create. So I'm curious to take a step back from this sort of question of identity. Identity is often anchored by certain things, right? It can be anchored by a startup. It can be anchored by values. It can be anchored by the people we surround ourselves with. I'm curious to hear the through lines that folks would draw from previous startups to current startups, particularly as it pertains to the values around how you build a company, how you build product, because I think the values endure. And so I'm curious to hear from folks about those values that they carry with them from one experience to the next. Phil, I'm going to circle back to you per your suggestion.
Well, I think it's values, and in my life, it's also been a lot of it is in people. It's been a lot of the same people that kind of go from company to company, which has been really great. I mean, I started my first company with some friends from college, and then some combination of that, has been the common string through every other company. It's always, we pick up some new people in orbit, each time, we lose some people, but there's some of the people who were there right from the beginning are still there, 25 years later, or however long it's been, which is great. And I've tried to do that kind of intentionally. One of the best pieces of advice that I've ever gotten, the second best piece of CEO advice that I've ever received was third best piece of advice, CEO advice that I've ever received, was from Steve Ballmer, actually, when he was CEO of Microsoft, and he said, like, everyone gets like about 100 people, maybe like 50, like it's not the same for everyone. Everyone gets like 100 people that are like the load-bearing people in their lives. And like, once you know them, you're full. You're not going to make like any new ones. Like you just like, that's your cap. That's your limit. Like your lifetime limit is like 100 people that are going to be like your go-to people for everything. And he said a lot of people like just burn through that really fast. Like by the time you get out of college, maybe you've already wasted like 50 of them. And he said, then these are the people that, these are the people that you just go to for everything. And hopefully you work with a bunch of these people, and these are the people that you sort of run the company with. But even if you don't, like, they're the people that you're going to call. You're going to like pick up the phone or whatever. I guess people used to call back then. And just be really mindful about like, who is that orbit for you? Who are those like 50 people or 100 people? And, try not to waste those slots, because you never get them back. And that's been really important. So I think like the value is absolutely, I will only ever work on something that I believe is good for the world if it succeeds. Otherwise it's just pointless. Like, it's so hard to build things that like, I couldn't motivate myself to do it unless I thought it was something that was really exciting and really worthwhile. And, there's a lot of values that kind of get refined and come along with it, but values by themselves are empty. They're embodied in people. And so being able to actually have a consistent through line of people has been super important. And there's a drawback to that. We have to work hard now to make sure that it doesn't feel like there's an inner circle, like a clique that like new people couldn't get into, which is difficult, right? Because like a bunch of us at Mmhmm, like it's easy to just like fall back and talk about Evernote and talk about the companies before. And that can be very alienating to new people. And of course we don't mean it to be. And so we have to like go out of our way to make sure that we're always adding to this inner circle. Even like some people that are inner circle, we've only known them for a month, but so we have to be aware of that. But I think as long as we manage that carefully and make sure that this isn't an exclusionary thing, it's actually been profoundly important for me to have a consistent thread of great co-founders. Yeah, third best piece of advice I ever got.
Can't wait to hear the other two.
You have to tell us the first one. You have to tell us the first one.
The most important CEO advice I ever got was from the CEO of Levi's Jeans. And he said, people totally misunderstand how often you're supposed to wash jeans. He's like, you're not supposed to wash jeans. Jeans are meant not to be washed. You're just supposed to wear them. And like, he's like, I wash my jeans like once every 2 years. I mean, it changed my life. Like that was...
This Chip?
Changed my life.
Amazing. I mean, I think, Phil, you hit the nail on the head. Like, people are a value, right? Identifying, going straight to people, that is a value in itself. And I want to spend a little bit more time on it. with everyone here, because I think we can all agree, right? Like, people are so important, and who we surround ourselves with, and all of that. I'm curious about, if whether you're advising founders or even just talking to friends, how do you make it actionable, right? Like, what is it that folks should look for? And I know we all have our own mental models here about, these people that we surround ourselves with, but I want to hear from you all. How do you break this down? How do you identify these people in your life? Yeah. Ben?
Yeah. I definitely went through some of the slots that Phil is talking to, coming from starting my first startup in Israel and building relationships there, and then moving here after we did Meerkat, which was a live streaming product, and then starting here from basically zero. I look a lot for reflection and self-awareness, and just ability of somebody to be thoughtful in a way that is not defensive. Partially because I'm an Israeli and we have tendency to provoke that without trying, which is like I don't know, just the culture is like, it's very hard on ourselves and by extension on other. Kind of compassion is very limited. And another, I just think it's a really important quality for founders to have ability to engage, because every relationship is basically based on the fact that two people are able to conduct a conversation that is self-aware and thoughtful, and ability to just like try to make each other better. And a lot of the time, in the beginning at least, you would find yourself like looking for a specific skill set, and that's not as important. I think that's very important, but it's not as important as the ability to have a productive conversation when things are not exactly the way you thought they are. Because my co-founder has this thing where it's like, a lot of the time you think you are together, but then you realize you're like this, because every side has a tendency to just hear what they want to hear, because just it's a human nature. And the ability to actually have the muscle to get closer and take a step back and understand what it is that we're trying to do here, I think that's the most important quality when you think about like that founding team. Yeah.
Awesome. We have some questions from the audience, which I would love to get to. So I'm gonna actually read both of them, and then folks can choose what they want to respond to. I think they're both great questions. The first one, definitely apt. How do you manage your fear as you build the platforms that you embarked on? We talked about fear a little bit, so yeah, diving in a little bit there. The second one, so this one is a bit longer, but there's a lot to learn when you begin a startup for any founder. Non-technical founders, younger founders, founders building products from industries that are different than their areas of expertise. How do you level up? Yeah, I think these are both great questions. Avni, you want to get us started on either of those? So
yeah,
either you're leveling up. Yeah.
Second, speaking as a non-technical founder, solo founder that came not from tech, and had to like figure my way out of all of that. I would say like the one saving grace for me is that, and maybe it answers the fear one as well, is that you just can't concern yourself with everything. You have to figure out how to just look at the step, like the one step in front of you. And then you have the question of prioritization, because there's like 15 different one steps that you could take. And for me, I've had to just figure out like, what's the thing that's going to kill you next, and like go tackle that one and not worry about like the other types of things. And that generally speaking has served me really well, which is even when I was non-technical and I had an idea and I could see how the app was going to work, but I couldn't figure out how to like pay for or find a developer or anything. I just tried to figure out like, how could I string it together myself? And I did, like, and there's incredible tools. And this was like 5 years ago even. And so I didn't worry about the rest of it. I think that's one of the things that can be really, really daunting if you look at the overall, like, you know, hill you're about to, or mountain you're about to climb. But if you look at the first step, it actually is quite reasonable. And if you're trying to figure out like, what's your approach, you really just have to figure out like, what's the most important thing that if you could just tackle that one, it'll unlock disproportionately other things. So for me, yeah, I mean, and I would say like, I still came from a lot of like understanding, different pieces. Like I come from a business background. So maybe like, you know, sure, I know finance and some of the other stuff, but like I had to teach myself a lot of different things. I think there's also a tendency for folks to feel like I don't know that, so I should hire my way out of that. I think almost like rather the opposite. If you don't know it and it's critical, you need to learn it to a sufficient degree that you can get like somewhere successful. And then you can hire yourself to it, because then you can also figure out what you should be hiring for. But that, like for me, pertains to basically everything. I will say for myself, like my hardest place was engineering, just because that was fully a black box. And then eventually I did learn how to code and all that. Like I'm a better partner now, but that's something that I've had to teach myself, how to be a really great product CEO and lean in and ask the really genuinely thoughtful questions. But apart from that, I've taught myself like labor law and like, you know, finance and like all those sorts of things. And to the degree of like, instead of paying like lawyers $2,000 to incorporate in the very first instance, I figured out how to do it like with an LLC and $200. I guess the point is that like, especially when you're starting off, there's so many things that you don't even need to worry about. So figure out like the thing that you do need to just get to the next place. And that's been the biggest thing that's served me well. And even today.
That's great. I was talking to my therapist about thinking too far ahead, and she would have very much appreciated the answer that I did not give, but the answer that you gave around, it's literally like the thing. Like you've got to prioritize. That is a skill in itself, being able to discriminate between, you know, the things that you feel like you have to do and you actually have to do. I think this is awesome. We have one more question that just came in. This is a fear. Sorry, I'm just reading through it quickly. The theme of fear is never going to go away, right? I feel like that's a big takeaway from today. The point is to not get rid of fear. The point is to manage it. This question, as a newbie in this space, a lot of what has hesitated me up to this point is fear. I suppose I've held myself back on entrepreneurial ideas because of fear of how hard it is to sustain a business. What advice would you all give someone related to business sustainability? So the marathon.
So there's a bunch of things on that, right? One is on just fear in general. Like there's not a, well, I, in all seriousness, have been for years reciting the Bene Gesserit litany against fear from Dune. Obviously, you know, everyone should read this continuously if you're going to start a company. It's probably the best thing written on the subject. Dune is kind of full of that. I'm psyched about the movie that's coming out. But the point is, yeah, like you like the dumbest thing you can be is fearless. You just have to acknowledge that it exists. You have to let it pass through you, and then you have to do the right thing anyway, regardless of what you're afraid or not. And this is like so much of the key of a lot of literature and philosophy, and certainly I think true and applicable. So yeah, the Bene Gesserit litany against fear is the most important tool. Some of the stuff in that book about like space travel and warping time space is like less applicable, but this thing is good. You know, scale is an interesting question, and sustainability are interesting questions, but I think those are really reversed now than what they used to be before. My friend and former partner at General Catalyst, Hemant, wrote a book Unscaled about this, where his main thesis is that it used to be that companies had to get big before they could have impact. because in order to have impact, you needed scale, you needed size, because that's how you got the distribution and the economies of scale and the continuity. And so the goal was to get big. You had to become a big, long-lasting company, and then you could try to change the world. And what he's saying is now that's flipped. So now, as a startup, you can get to impact first. You can make a difference first, and then you can decide, once you've made a difference, whether or not you deserve to or want to scale or even continue. It's really a reversal, and it's a reversal for lots of reasons, for lots of, it's basically what technology has allowed the world to do, companies to do. So when I think about scale, like how do we get big, or even being long lasting, like at Evernote, I used to talk all the time about being a 100-year startup. I've kind of realized that both scale and business continuity are second order operations, that we don't even deserve to think about those until we know that we've had an impact, until we get to impact first. And this, I think, is like the best news for doing a startup in 2020 versus even 10 years ago. So we have particular ways of measuring impact. This is not like an empty thing. We analyze and measure it, and we say, okay, how do we know that we are getting closer and closer to actually having impact? And once we've solved an important problem for someone, then we say, okay, well, we're pretty confident that we are the default answer to an important question for at least somebody. Okay, how do we become the default answer for a slightly more important question for 10 people? And then, 100 people, and then 10,000 people, and then 1 billion people. But at what point do we want to stop? Like maybe we don't want to get to 1 billion people for every product we make. This is the whole point of All Turtles, is like not everything ought to be a multi-billion user unicorn, but everything has to have impact. So I'd just flip that question around. I'd be like, forget about how long you can survive, forget about how big you can get. Focus on having an impact on somebody for something important. And then once you're confident that that exists, then decide how much more you want to do.
I love so much of that answer, just because, again, the space that I'm building in the space of like, it butts like childcare and like education and all sorts of different things that don't necessarily have like the margins that other kind of companies and categories do. That sometimes like it requires reframing what impact and what scale and all that kind of stuff looks like. And then for what it's worth, like this is a separate conversation, but finding like the investors and the type of capital that also like match that vision. But it's a conversation that I've had many times over, because you shouldn't be so focused on the scale part, like focused on the impact. And I think like, I love that, because for me, like, it's not that the fear is very far, but it's that if you're like working on something that you feel is ultimately going to make impact, or you're working on something that is so worthwhile, like the fear isn't the dominant emotion in the room. It's there, but it's kind of along for the ride.
Awesome. Yeah, I love this. It's like impact. I don't know what the correct analogy is here. We could probably find a good one together, but impact is like water, or it's more than water, right? It's like the thing that keeps you going. I feel like if you're making impact, if you're building a product that serves an audience that has a real problem, like sustainability, the long term, it's like you don't worry so much about where you're going to find water, because you have water, and then you keep looking for it. Sounded better in my head.
The book by Hemant it's called Unscaled.
Great.
It's like, I think you can think of it as impact first, right? Versus like impact is the last thing you do once you've built a successful business. What he's saying is, yeah, in 2020, it's actually impact first. And, he is, he's one of the best VCs I know. And, their whole point is this is how they evaluate startups. So they are no longer looking at startups to say, what is their chance of scaling? They're looking at startups saying, how fast can they get to impact? Which is like a big change in the world.
It's so great to hear that. It's such an antidote, I think, to so much of what people fear they have to build, right? Again, talking to founders who say, well, this isn't going to be Facebook. As if that's a bad thing, right? Because they're thinking about that scale first, and not the problem. This has been fantastic. It was amazing to have a front seat to amazing thoughts, reflections. We talked about mountains to climb, sprinting through marathons, skiing. That's not what I expected at all, but it definitely helped. It will help these lessons stick. So thanks so much to all the panelists.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That was a great conversation. And I hope you all learned as much as I did out there. And I want to give a huge thanks to Lindsay Pettingill for moderating this, and immense gratitude to our panelists, Phil Libin, Ben Rubin, and Avni Patel Thompson. And also thank you to the viewers for joining us. If you enjoyed this session, please follow Worklife VC across social media and on YouTube. Give this video a like and definitely join us for more events. Ciao.